Wake that ass up.
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.
Morning, everybody. It's DJ Envy Angela Yee, Charlamagne the Guy. We are the Breakfast Club. We have a special guest on the line, Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Hey, man, we knew you when you were just a little mayor down there in South Bend, man. Now
That's
look
right.
at you. Look at you. Congratulations on the new position.
Thank you.
So what
I'm
is the
excited.
position? What are you doing? What is the position? Break it down.
So it's everything related to how people get around, right? We're talking about transit. We got a federal transit authority, supports subways and buses, the Federal Aviation Administration for air travel, ports and airports, planes, trains, and automobiles, all of that, even pipeline safety is part of the department. And it's always an exciting place to be, at least if you care about these things. But this moment right now, this moment that we're in, I think is the most important moment in terms of what we can do for transportation in the country because of the president's jobs plan, which hopefully we'll get to talk about. So there's never been a more exciting moment to work these issues. And, I think about it as a mayor, right? Because as a mayor, you're getting up, you're thinking about potholes, you're worried about how to make sure people can get around the community. But now we get to work those issues for the whole country.
Is this the position you wanted?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to go wherever I could be useful, but this is definitely the place that I think most connects, first of all, to what I used to work on, and also just to things I care about and think are exciting. I mean, I'm kind of a nerd that way when it comes to transportation because I grew up fascinated by these things, and now, we're at such a moment in terms of what's, things that are familiar, what's going on with cars, what's going on with air travel, but also there's a cutting edge where we've got drones, we've got commercial space travel, we've got automated vehicles, we've got electric vehicles. All of these things are hitting too. And it's just, I think, never been a cooler time to be working on this.
I saw a lot of conversation based around what you said about racism and how it's sometimes been a part of highway planning and construction. So can you break that down for us?
Yeah, I was a little surprised that some people were so surprised because I think to a lot of others it's been pretty obvious. But it starts by understanding the history, right? So if you look at the way that a lot of highways, for example, have been built in this country, a lot of that was at the expense of Black and brown neighborhoods. And sometimes it was just out of convenience. So it's expensive to buy up a bunch of property to run a highway through it. Black neighborhoods are often undervalued, and so it was the path of least resistance. Sometimes it was about power, right? The neighborhoods that had the least power to speak up in a community process and say, wait a minute, let's have that road go there instead of here. Sometimes that was part of the explanation, but it's very important to understand that sometimes this was very intentional. There is evidence from history in places from Atlanta to New York City that sometimes the way that a road was built, the way that a highway was set up, the way that one part of town was divided from another was viewed as part of the mechanics, the mechanism of segregation, that you could keep two parts of town separated through something like a highway. So when I talk about racial equity in transportation, it's not just about making sure that everybody has access to good transportation, and that's its own issue, right? Transit deserts, where you have a neighborhood, often Black and brown neighborhoods that don't have very good resources, but also literally when the money was spent, where was it spent and how was it spent and what effect did it have? And often you'd have sometimes a thriving neighborhood that got cut into or just rolled over entirely through the use of federal transportation dollars. And I don't say that in order to make people feel guilty. I'm saying it because we can do it differently this time. The president's proposed the biggest jobs investment since World War II. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. So this time, let's get it right, including money to reconnect some of those same places that were divided in the past.
Now, I did hear that, back in the day, especially like in areas like Long Island and where the beaches are, they would make these overpasses that were too low for buses. Because back in the day, of course, minorities, Black people couldn't afford cars, so they would have to take the bus. So that way the bus couldn't get to those beaches. So more of the rich white people would be able to get to the beaches and not allow us to get to some of those areas. Is that what you're talking about as well?
Yeah, that's a great example. The Robert Caro's history book, the Power Broker, about a biography of Robert Moses, who engineered a lot of these things, describes this, and it's exactly as you're saying. Overpasses a little lower than they usually would have been, so the buses couldn't get through, and the buses would have been how a lot of Black and Puerto Rican residents would have been able to access those beaches. So that's another example of how this is not just incidental. This is not just out of neglect. There were some real choices made here, but now we can make different choices, better choices, And that's part of what's exciting about the jobs plan.
Well, what is the jobs plan exactly? I'm hearing it's a transformative plan that's going to impact generations. So what is it exactly?
Yeah, so it's roads and bridges. First of all, just fixing 20,000 miles of roads, 10,000 bridges around the country. It's improving our ports and airports. It's improving transit. In fact, we're going to double the resources for transit. And this is important also from a racial justice perspective because Black and brown Americans are more likely to rely on transit to get to where they need to go. This is about making sure we invest in workforce because the other equity question that's really big here is who's going to get to do the work, right? If we're going to be building bridges, fixing roads, and improving ports and airports, and enhancing subways, who actually gets to do the work? What kind of businesses get in on it, and what kind of workers get in on that? I'm hearing from a lot of elected representatives who point out that sometimes they'll see a construction project going on in a neighborhood, and the workers working on the construction project don't resemble the people from the community or the neighborhood. So what can we do to make sure that there are apprenticeship programs to make more pathways available to get these building trades jobs? All of this is contemplated in the plan. It's $2.25 trillion. And there's a bit of a fight going on over whether you can call it infrastructure, right? So there's things like roads and bridges that everybody agrees are infrastructure, but there's also investments in internet access. We think that's infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Because you need to be able to get on the internet to do your homework, to get a job the same way. I know 50 years ago, people weren't thinking about the internet, but they were putting in the interstate highway system. Right now, you need both. You need a highway connection and you need a broadband connection in order to do well in the economy. So we've got things like that. We've got measures to deal with water. Water is definitely infrastructure, at least from a mayor's perspective. And so the president's plan would get rid of all lead service pipes everywhere in the country. It's a huge undertaking, but you've got to do it. Otherwise, you still have families worried about whether they can get clean, safe drinking water that isn't going to poison their children.
Pete, this is when the age gap is clear between you and some of your peers, right? That being that you're trying to convince them that the internet is infrastructure. Of course it is in 2021.
I think so. I mean, I think all of this is generational too, right? The truth is we're living off of infrastructure that was built generations ago, and we've kind of been coasting for a long time, taking out investments for 30 or 40 years, which is why they put out report cards from the American Society of Civil Engineers, for example. They're giving us C's and D's on the infrastructure in this country. And other countries are leaping ahead of us. I mean, you look at the investments that China is making. You look at some of the airports around the world, and you compare them to our airports here in the U.S. You can see we're falling behind. That's a generational issue, right? Because a new generation can't thrive in an economy that doesn't have good infrastructure. Same with internet. Same with climate. So the other really important thing we have to do here is make investments that are going to help head off climate change. Transportation is the single biggest source of greenhouse gases in our entire economy. So if we can get more people in electric vehicles and make them affordable, if we can create more transit options so you don't need a vehicle at all in order to get to where you're going, if we can improve the energy grid after things like what we saw in Texas, right? That's infrastructure, I think. All of those things add up to a better climate future too. And it's absolutely a question of generational opportunity.
Where's the pushback coming from then? What is the pushback?
So we're hearing a couple of things. One is this kind of, well, this piece or that piece isn't infrastructure. And to me, part of me wants to say, yes, it is. But part of me wants to say, fine, call it whatever you like, but still vote for it because it's still good. At the end of the day, this is an infrastructure themed plan, but the bottom line is jobs, and it's going to create jobs. So we're hearing a bit of that, but I think that's a semantic, philosophical debate. And then, of course, not everybody wants to pay for it, right? So the president set this up in a way that's fully paid for over the course of 15 years by resetting the corporate tax rate. 55 major corporations paid zero in taxes, according to a recent study. And we're talking about sometimes on billions of dollars in profits. Now, this is not anti-business. We're not trying to soak anybody. The rate of corporate taxes we're going for is 28. And what's important to understand about that number, 28, is it's actually lower than the rate that it's been for most of our lifetimes. For most of our lifetimes, it's been 35. And then they cut it, and a lot of analysts would say they cut it too far under the last administration. We're just trying to reset it to a reasonable level. So there's corporate tax rate at 28, closing some loopholes, and there's some resistance to that from the other side. The president's open-minded. He wants to hear how they would pay for it, and we're waiting to see what proposals they come from. But I'll tell you, I I have not heard from a lot of people, even elected officials, who say that we shouldn't be improving our infrastructure. I think the real question is just how big we go and how we're going to pay for it.
I wanted to ask about, electric cars and what they're trying to do with electric cars. I have a couple of questions. One, with the electric cars, I know they're trying to do it, but the government stopped with the tax rebates, which made people want to get some of these electric cars because then they get some rebates off of that. So they stopped that. And also, what happens to all those oil companies who, America has invested so much money in, and with the pipelines and getting, so what happens with that?
Right. So there's got to be a transition toward clean energy in this country. And that does mean transitioning how we get our power for power generation and how we fuel our vehicles. Now, the thing with electric vehicles is you get a savings when you buy them because you don't have to buy gas anymore. You still have to power them up.
But you got to, but I mean, it's still electricity and you got to plug it in your crib. So you're still paying for something.
That's right. And so what we've got to do is make sure that we're buying down that cost to help people get in on electric vehicles. That's what the idea of more rebates are about. So you mentioned that there's a cap on the existing rebates. This bill would have more rebates available to help make it affordable. And we think when we do that, the other thing is the more we as a country get into making electric vehicles, the lower the cost gets. And it's really important to the president and to all of us, I think, that these EVs be made in America, because a lot of other countries are producing electric vehicles.
Right.
We are too, but we should be making sure we lead the world. So part of it's cost. Now, the other thing is range, right? So even if it's affordable, you might think twice about buying an electric vehicle if you're not sure that you can go on a road trip and get to where you're going without having to look for a charger. So the president's plan calls for 500,000 electric vehicle chargers. And we'll place those around the country so that you never have to worry about that. We get those two things right, the cost and the charging, and that will position America to be leading this future. This is definitely where the world is going. But the question of how fast is a question with a lot of stakes in terms of American leadership and in terms of the climate, of course.
I started to say Mayor Pete, Secretary Pete. How can we ensure that the American Jobs Plan directly helps Black people? Because we see a lot of times these plans, they don't trickle down to the Black people the way it should. How can we make sure it directly impacts Black people?
Yeah, I think this is really important, and it's not going to be automatic that it goes well. I mean, this is why we need to make sure we have things like apprenticeship programs. We need to work with organized labor to make sure there are more pathways into these jobs. These are good jobs with middle-class incomes. By the way, most of the jobs we're talking about creating here will not require a college degree. And so this is a great way for people to get a start in life or to raise a family. Whether they're going after there's definitely some engineering jobs that will be created that require degrees, PhDs, but a lot of this we're talking about, these are not mysterious jobs. And we're talking about construction work, we're talking about insulators, we're talking about electrical workers. And we know that there could and should and need to be more Black representation in those skilled trades. So part of it's that. Part of it's the kinds of business ownership that gets in on this, right? We need to build, and there's an example of doing this through infrastructure, actually in Atlanta. So a generation ago, part of how Mayor Maynard Jackson helped build a Black middle class in that city was by making sure when they had a major infrastructure project for the airport, that a business community with a lot of diverse ownership got in on that. My department alone procures $6 or $7 or $8 billion in a year directly, in addition to all the money that flows through here. So the business opportunity here is enormous, but we've got to make sure that we're supporting those businesses as they grow.
Yeah,
we're doing what we can. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we're doing what we can already within the law. So, for example, we just put out a $1 billion grant program where we as a department set criteria telling the communities what we're looking for. And they come to us with projects and then we fund them. And in that program, for the first time in this way, we're explicitly saying we want racial equity to be one of the things that you are considering and explaining when you bring that program, the grants in that program to us. Same thing with another program called Build, which is about $887 million. We put it out soon after I took this office, and now we're going through the applications. So there's a lot we can do that's consistent with the law now. But if we pass this new law that the president's proposing, it's a different level of investment, and the benefits are huge.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when it comes to the construction, you got to holler at McKissick and McKissick. They're a black-owned construction company owned by a black woman. So make sure she gets one of those contracts as well. And I want to switch gears a little bit too. You know, you're a veteran, right?
Yeah.
So when you see what happened to Lieutenant Karen Nasrio, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, in Virginia at the hands of the police, how did that make you feel?
I don't know that I have words for how it makes me feel. I mean, everybody says that they stand with those who wear the uniform, right? We say support our troops. And then you see one of our troops in uniform being treated that way. And it is so opposite of the basic idea that we stand up for those who stand up for us. And in another era, when I'm sure that was happening just as much, we wouldn't know about it, right? Because there wouldn't be footage of it. Now we do. And it's one more fact that confronts America as we have this national conversation about whether this is going to continue.
Does this administration really care about holding police accountable?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why this administration, for example, is pushing for the George Floyd Policing Act to be passed. The House passed it. We need to get that through the Senate Act. I mean, this country is not whole until something changes. And I think, I know that's important to the president. It's important, I think, to everybody in this administration. And the country will be hurting until we can fix this.
But when does it stop? It seems like it's the same scenario over and over and over and over again. It just seems like there's no accountability and nothing ever changes.
Well, there has to be accountability. And again, that's part of what needs to change in terms of reforms. Look, we get that a lot of the decisions are local, but there's also a national climate, a national culture, and there are national laws like the George Floyd Act that would make a difference here. I mean, we're up against the entire history of this country, right? It's before the founding of this country. We're up against 400 years. But I really believe that it has to change in our lifetime or the country doesn't make it.
You know, something else recent I wanted you to address is ending the war in Afghanistan. And I know that was a very difficult decision, and I've been hearing both sides of it. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, a lot of us, when the news came out, I think a lot of us who served were reaching out to each other and texting each other. And it's pretty emotional for anybody who was there. The thing I keep going back to is, you know, when I left, that was 7 years ago now, it was 2014. And I thought we were some of the last troops turning out the lights. And that was 7 years ago. Now we're 20 years in. And what the president is saying is this has to come to an end. And he's accepting the responsibility. He said he's the fourth president to have this conflict on his hands, and he's not going to pass it on to a fifth. So the president, I think, is doing the right thing for the country at a difficult time, because there have never been easy answers in a place like Afghanistan. But this is how we move on and how we do right by American national security.
And man, Pete, I know you got a heart out, so I want to respect that. So I just want to say, man, I want to salute you, because one thing I think Democrats suck at is engaging with their audience outside of election cycles. Like, we only see them when they want us to vote, which I think is a huge mistake. And it says a lot that with all the black people around Joe Biden who came here during election cycles, that the first person we've heard from since the administration has been in the White House is you. So thank you for valuing, you know, our audience.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm honored to be with you. I'll come by anytime.
Absolutely.
I got one question. You know,
Yeah.
Gun control. You know, it seems like there's a mass shooting every other week. But we talk about it all the time. A lot of the times people that purchase these guns purchase it legally, but they have problems. They have mental health problems. How are we looking on making sure these gun control laws are a lot more serious and a lot more protecting of the regular people?
Yeah, I mean, we're waking up to news again. Today it's in my home state, Indianapolis. We'll see where it is tomorrow. And there's the mass shootings, and then there's the everyday shootings. And we're the only country that seems to tolerate this as routine. So, you know, Congress needs to act. We need to act on background checks. We need to act on a lot of things. But what the president did was use his executive authority to at least do what we could, to do things about, for example, these kits that you can assemble into guns. And another thing that's in there, to your question, is a model red flag law. So the idea of a red flag law is that if a family is concerned about someone who has these mental health issues, they can go through a process to make sure that they don't have access to a weapon. We should be very clear that in places where guns are more widely available to people with mental health struggles, there are more gun suicides. Not all suicide attempts are alike, and we're more likely to lose somebody to suicide if they have access to a gun. So we should at least be able to agree on this much. Now, I haven't been in Washington for long, but I'm learning one thing about this place is sometimes things that people agree on around the country in both parties, whether it's infrastructure or whether it's background checks on guns, it doesn't quite work that way in Congress. But I think that keeping an insistence on progress is got to have some kind of impact. If you go in front of the Capitol right now, the lawn is planted with flags, each one of which represents people who have been lost to gun violence.
Right.
And it's another one of those things that if we can't change it on the watch of the generations now in charge, then we never will. So it's now or never, and we just can't ever get used to it, even though I think we've gotten used to it.
Now, Secretary Pete, you came up here and you told us your story. The first
You're not
time
going to
you up
respect
here.
his heart out?
And
Yeah,
well,
he's gotta go.
You got 2 minutes.
He said 9:25.
Yeah, 9:25.
I'll
They
be
said
quick.
9:30.
No.
9:25. Oh, I'm sorry. I just had last question. And you talked about how difficult it was for you to come out when you were starting. Have you watched The Bachelor or seen The Bachelor with Colton Underwood and how difficult it was for him to come out? Did you see that yet or no? I'm just curious.
No, I saw something about it on Twitter, but I haven't caught up on it yet.
Oh, okay. Just curious. That's all. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Secretary Pete. We appreciate you.
Unless
Thank
you got time. How much more time you got?
No, I really do have to go now.
Okay, just making sure. All right, because we still got to talk about why they trying to suppress the black vote, but we talk about that another time.
There's a lot to talk about there, but yeah, we'll catch you again in the future. I hope.
My man, thank you.
Thank you, Secretary
Thank
Pete.
you. Be well.